Welcome back to the newest episode of Brogressive. I'm here with my co-host Ben. We have a really special episode planned for you guys today. We have Split Ticket and the Yale Youth Poll here with Armin Thomas and Milan Singh. Armin and Milan, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to be here.
Thanks for having us. Very excited.
I gotta say, having two of the heavyweights of polling, it's making me feel super inadequate about having no clue how data science works or how these numbers or Excel. But anyways,
that's why they're here to explain it, so us laymen can understand.
Armin's more of a heavyweight than I am.
No. I just make models. Milan here is the one who's with the big dogs.
He's the one running the Yale Youth Poll, which I was to say, if anyone has been living under a rock or is not interested in polling, that's what we're here to talk about. So let's go ahead and open up the, I see we got the crosstabs here, but let's go ahead and open it up. Milan, take the stage.
Yeah. So we just got out of the field about 2 weeks ago with the spring version of our survey. We did our first survey after we established ourselves last fall. We asked a bunch of questions, stuff on generic ballot for 2026, Democratic primary, Republican primary in 2028, social policy, education policy. That's a salient topic right now. We did some interesting A/B tests that I'm happy to talk about later on homelessness policy and then taxation, government spending, the budget deficit, some stuff on foreign policy and the border, including immigration. And then finally, our usual battery of objective and subjective civics questions. Stuff like, can people correctly define the Senate filibuster? Mostly no. Objective stuff like, what do people see the role of the judiciary as? Yeah, a bunch of stuff. Happy to get into it.
Well, real quick, what's an A/B test? I'm not familiar.
Oh, yeah, sorry. An A/B test is we split our sample in half, and half of them gets one version of something, half of them gets another version. So specifically, say with the homelessness one. So what we did is we split the sample in half, and they each got one version of a question. So the first version is split A. The conservative message is the same in both. It just says homeless people are often drug addicts or mentally ill, and they need to be taken off the streets and locked up to protect law-abiding citizens. This we kind of took from typical Republican or conservative messaging on homelessness, stuff that you might see the New York Post run, stuff that you might see conservatives online talk about. And then in each version of the split, we offered a different progressive message. So in version A, we offered a progressive message where we framed things as a human right. So housing is a human right, and the way to fix homelessness is for the government to guarantee housing to the poor. And the second version says, our response to homelessness should focus on helping people find shelter and treatment, not on throwing poor people in jail. So similar policy implications are obviously not super detailed. The main difference is how the progressive side is framed. We did this because I was curious to see how human rights framing impacts support for progressive policy. You see progressives often say, for example, healthcare is a human right, or a living wage is a human right, or a good job is a human right. And I'm assuming they're saying this because they believe it helps persuade people. And I wanted to check whether that was actually true. And at least when it comes to homelessness, we found that it was not true. We found that, just look at the data here, when you frame it as a human right, about 63% of people take the progressive position, and total 38% take the conservative position or say they're not sure. When you frame it not as a human right, 85% take the progressive side, 8% take the conservative side, and then 7% are not sure. So it does seem, at least for this issue, that framing things as a human right reduces support for the progressive policy.
Well, and it's interesting. I noticed that the non-human right framing also does mention treatment specifically, kind of in to address the drug addict part from the other options. So I wonder that might play a role as well. But
yeah, it might.
That's interesting.
I think it's that's definitely a good point. It's not certain that the human right framing is the main driver, the biggest driver, the only driver of differences in support. But I do think it's interesting, right? I have the more left wing people you see talking about homelessness often focus on what's called housing first, which is as it sounds, get people into housing first, then focus on the other stuff. And a more moderate liberal approach often talks about, oh well, we need to get people in treatment, we need to get people in shelters if they're having drug addiction problems, etc. So yeah, you're right. That could be a factor as well in kind of changing the support.
Well, interesting. Okay, well, so with these A/B tests, obviously you frame the progressive policies as human rights. I mean, it seems to me that this is part of a growing pattern of toxicity of progressivism, if I'm getting that right. the idea that all these, oh, it's a human right things or things that you would just otherwise associate with the city of San Francisco are
I
a
was
little bit toxic.
going to mention that. Yeah, right. What this poll seems to be showing is not even necessarily, you know, an opposition to homelessness in general, the way Republicans would want, because the second option says we want to treat homelessness, right? If you phrased it as give people houses versus, lock all the homeless people up and throw away the key, that's one thing. But you said, let's focus on treating these people, right? People don't want homelessness to be a thing, and they think, right, this is a more reasonable, sensible approach that is something that's more, baby steps rather than pie in the sky. And that's different from the predominant progressive way of thinking, which says, we deem something as a human right. And once that thing is a human right, you have to argue for it every single time, or else you oppose human rights and you insert whatever bad word that you want to call that person, right? And as we've now seen, that style of messaging among Republican voters, obviously, but now Democratic voters as well too, they are starting to reject that en masse.
It's interesting that like that kind of like maximalist framing where it tries to almost make it impossible to take the more conservative position by framing it in such black and white terms kind of has the opposite effect. And we were talking about this last episode in terms of immigration and how some of the backlash relates to progressives kind of more taking the framing away from like a self-interest, rational choice model for the voter, where it's like, here's how immigration is going to improve the country. And these are great people who are going to come and lift us all up and improve our country as a whole, versus these are people who we need to help. It's a human rights issue. Like it's our responsibility. And I wonder if this goes hand in hand a little bit. And that's kind of like a broader progressive messaging issue at the moment.
I think a lot of it is related to everything that everyone has said about, education, polarization, and all, right? Americans, especially, like to think of themselves as smart, practical people who don't like being told what to do by, you know, you can use the word uppity, right? People who, occupy more influence than they ought to, right? And in this case, these are people who don't necessarily share the same cultural values as the people they're trying to convince, who come out, come to these places and say, these are these human rights that you have to support. And, I don't read everything that Matt Iglesias says, but people who do will note that he says that a lot of those people are very, very annoying. Right. And that's a big reason as to why a lot of their messages get rejected, is that the way that they present themselves is fundamentally annoying, which is to say, you're wrong. I'm smarter than you. If you don't believe this, you are stupid and you need to be re-educated. Right. And that's right. In every polling question, people hear one thing, but then under that, there's the subtext for what it's actually trying to get at. Right. And they're instinctively responding to that. Whereas the way question B is framed is not only, I think, more in line with where people are, but also, you know, is framed in a way that's a little bit more agreeable and on the level of where people are in terms of how they want to be talked to.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I think that kind of shows that in the data is that if you look at the difference between question A and question B, a lot of the decreased support for the progressive position when you go from B to A goes to people saying they're not sure. It's not that you see people, agreeing with the conservative side. Um, it's a lot of people who say, ooh, compared to that more reasonable, more baby steps option, that's like, ooh, I'm not necessarily on the side of the most right wing position here, but I'm not sure I can endorse the most full throated left wing position either. I think that's important to notice as well.
This is a really really great day for radical centrism. Is what I'm getting at here. Is that what I'm hearing?
On that note, maybe we should take a look at I think what drew the biggest headlines from this poll, your Democratic 2028 primary top line results, which I thought were very interesting. And I believe this was your first post-election Democratic primary poll for 2028. So did these results surprise you? Obviously, the big headlines with AOC and Pete Buttigieg overperforming probably where people's expectations were. Kamala underperforming a little bit, still in first place. So, what were your big takeaways, and were you surprised with these results?
Yeah, I was surprised that AOC polled as high as she did. That was not what I was expecting going in. I thought it would be Harris, then probably Pete, and then some smattering of like the most well-known other people on the list. As you can see down here, a lot of these people have pretty low name recognition, so that might hamper some of their vote shares. But I'm surprised how well AOC did. I think, the context of her doing the National Fighting Oligarchy tour with Bernie, maybe that's a reason. Maybe Democratic primary voters are more aware of her, or, registered Democrats are more aware of her. In terms of favorabilities, which potential candidates national Democrats like and don't, I was a little surprised to see Fetterman as far underwater as he was. I assumed he'd come in at kind of like 9.5 or something. I also don't know what Stephen A. Smith did to make people so mad at him. Um, I don't, I mean, he has pretty low name recognition, but like,
Calling out Brawny. He
yeah, like,
crossed the line.
I guess. I mean, maybe LeBron rigged this poll. 34% of people saying they don't like him. I was a little surprised with that.
Yeah, I'm calling BS. Honestly, a good amount of Democratic primary voters answering a poll 3.5 years before the actual election probably don't know who Stephen A. Smith is, if we're being honest.
Well, I
Right.
was I was going to ask with the sampling on this one, like, are we at all worried it's like a sampling issue because we all know primary voters are not the same as general election, and these people that are answering this kind of like you said, poll this early, are very different than your
Right. The
casual. Hey,
people
I
who are
show.
answering a poll like this now are probably all on Twitter, right? This is the most plugged in group of people who are saying these things, right? And if you look at the Democratic primary base that's on Twitter, in a lot of this appeal is not really ideological, right? It's a team sport. It's right. Which star, batter do we want to hit as many home runs out of the park? Right? And that changes based on the latest actions that people take, right? You saw there was that poll with Cory Booker that, rose really high after he did his filibuster thing. Honestly, you should include Chris Van Hollen in the
Yeah.
next poll.
Yeah, I'm sure if we had been in the field after Booker's filibuster, we would have put him in, and he probably would have scored pretty well.
I
We didn't
think with
because at the time he wasn't.
AOC, so you're surprised about AOC? I'm really not as surprised about AOC because AOC's role within the Democratic Party, she's been around for 6 years now, right? She's not
Hmm.
new anymore. When she first got onto the scene. I was in college at the time. I remember all the energy about that. One of my friends actually worked on that campaign in 2018. She was very much an insurgent, right? Going from the outside in. And the way that, a lot of mainstream Democrats who fundamentally they might not love everyone in the establishment, but they broadly thought that the direction of the Democratic Party was, in going in the right direction, they were afraid of what AOC was trying to do. 6 years later, I don't think the Democratic establishment, the way it is, has that credibility. And 6 years later on, AOC herself has also built up enough loyalty in terms of actually standing for the capital D Democratic Party brand that,
Hmm.
the MSNBC watching demographic of establishment liberals is actually willing to say, you know what, I'm negatively polarized by Trump, one, but two, she's been standing in the trenches long enough that I'm, open to voting for her for president. And, she does speak to where the primary base is in a very, very, appealing way in that sense. So I'm not as surprised that that's where it is, in terms of AOC. Pete Buttigieg, I think that's just an artifact of, the demographic that answers these polls being, again, the MSNBC watching college educated liberal demographic that loves Pete Buttigieg.
Right. When I've talked to some of my friends, both at the youth poll and just otherwise about Pete, most of them think he will not make it on the Democratic primary, um, primarily because they think he will not do well in South Carolina, which, I mean, probably is true. If I had to
I
guess,
mean, do you remember 4 year? I guess
I
it'll be
remember.
8 years ago. There was
Yeah,
that
I remember.
SNL joke they made about how a black family, and they said they were supporting Pete Buttigieg, and everybody was like, "Ha ha ha."
I remember that one Washington Post column that was like, "Is this because of homophobia?" And there was a huge furor
Oh
online
my
about like, "Is this
gosh.
racist to say that this might be because of homophobia?" But yeah, I mean, he never polled well in South Carolina, and he did decently in Iowa and in more northern states where the Democratic primary electorate was more white.
So essentially, it's more what we're seeing in the data versus, well, what I don't say it tracks logically, but there's a correlation. No causation, nothing uh, to draw. But also, I guess the other thing too, I want to circle back though with AOC. is this one of those situations where this primary base, like you said, the MSNBC watching college liberals, which I say that knowing that that includes me, are way more favorable to voting for someone like that? Because with all these like favorability ratings and all these, oh, most likely to win the nominee, it's like, I don't know if that's a winning candidate for anyone who is no longer in that camp. Very similar to,
Well,
oh, go
that's
ahead.
the thing. Go ahead, Milan.
No, we did. We're waiting to get. So we have all the data back from this. We didn't get a chance to clean all of it. We had some issues with the max diff tests. For those who don't know, a max diff question is you might have a list of, say, in this case, 16 candidates. We asked people um, which of these candidates is more likely to beat a Republican to win the presidency, and we presented them two randomly. And then, in expectation, if the candidates were all equally likely, you'd expect them to get 50%, right? They'd be selected 50% of the time because they're each shown. We still have to crunch the numbers for that. We have the raw numbers, but they're not cleaned. By that, I mean that what you should be doing if you want to be very precise is you say, oh, count the times they were shown to people and then divide or use that as the denominator for the times they were picked. We still are waiting on that, and because it's exam season next week, I haven't asked anyone to do it yet. I did eyeball it. Eyeballing it, the most electable candidate among Democrats was Mark Cuban, then Josh Shapiro, then the least electable candidates were. Let me look this up. I sent this to someone.
I'd be curious where Kamala would rank in that. That'd be
I think she
interesting.
was like middle of the pack. Yeah, the least electable candidates were Stephen A. Smith was the worst, Ruben Gallego second worst, and then J.B. Pritzker and Gretchen Whitmer tied for the third worst. Some of that might be a function of just not everyone knows who Stephen A. Smith is. People might not know who Ruben Gallego is. But like I would guess, I mean, Armin, you give me your take, but if I asked you who the most electable people on this list were, I don't think you'd disagree with that as a top three.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, I think that, I mean, we all know Democrats have been harping on electability since 1972, right?
Yeah.
Um, like this is not new. Like my mother, every time there's some vaguely liberal Democrat who gets nominated, she'll mention George McGovern and Walter Mondale, right? Um, and granted, the left has not been drugged that thoroughly in now 40 years, but 2024 kind of felt like that to a lot of people. And so they're really, scared of screwing up again. Um, I think it's notable that the top three there were Cuban, Shapiro, and Kelly, who are all, white men, right? There's definitely a sense that, okay, you tried a woman, it didn't work. You tried a
Fine.
black woman, it also didn't work. So maybe America is just fundamentally a misogynistic country or something. I'm not, an expert on gender relations, so I can't really speak to that. But um, I think it makes sense, right? They know that Mark Kelly is an astronaut, right? When you think of what you know about these people, right? Mark Cuban is a businessman. He's a lot richer than Donald Trump. He's from
Right. So,
Texas and he owns a sports team, right? The average person's ideological sense does not boil down to liberal or conservative, right? Nobody thinks, oh, he supports this bill or that bill, and that's going to make him do well with this demographic, right? It's
Vibes.
it's like it's like the question in the poll, right? Can I get a beer with this guy? Is this guy cool,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Mark Cuban is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Josh Shapiro, very very cool guy,
Yeah.
right?
You got the
Mark
Meek
Kel-
Mill endorsement.
Mark Kelly, the guy literally went to space, right? Like those people are objectively, what I think the average voter would say are cool. In terms of that being the electorate, I mean, Josh Shapiro won by 15. Okay, granted, he won by
It was
15 against a
Mastriano.
crazy guy, but
Yeah.
he still won
They
by
still
15.
won it.
And
Well,
he
He won
Kamala
won,
his
lost
AG.
by 3 against a crazy guy, so
Yeah.
and and
And he won
as
his AG races
yeah,
comfortably.
the attorney general races, right? He won both of those when Trump. Okay, well, the first one was when Trump won the state, and the second one, some would say Trump won the state then, but no, Biden won the state.
Right.
Um, no, and for Kelly, right? Kelly notoriously has been very good at winning in tough, environments. Right, 2020, Trump nearly won the state, and the electorate that showed up in 22 definitely was pro-Trump, and he still won. And some of that was, possibly due to Blake Masters, right? But even in 20, he ran against McSally, right, in
Yeah.
2020.
Seems like by all accounts a normal
And
Republican.
definitely at this point, the best Republican candidate that Arizona Republicans have, nominated in the past 8 years.
Yeah.
Um, So
I mean, kind of speaking on what Armin mentioned about perceptions of candidates, what's seen as cool, what's not. I was talking to a couple of my friends about this, after the election over the last few months, and something one of them said to me stuck out, which was, it is not cool to be a Democrat if you're a young man these days. And I think that is really true. I saw like the stupidest clip of like Andrew Schultz today where he was like, I would used to be a Democrat because Bill Clinton cheated on his wife in the Oval and that
I
was
saw
base.
that.
And now
is that a
Trump, I'm like, okay,
podcast?
you're a
I'm
fucking
sorry, I
jack
have
off.
no idea who these people are.
He's a shit comedian.
He's in the
Oh,
Joe Rogan crew, kind of.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, I don't interact with those people at
The
all.
only one, like, Gillis is funny, but Andrew Schultz
Mhm.
is like, I don't know. I don't think he's that funny, but I think it does get at something. Zachary and I were looking at the crosstabs today. He tweeted this out and he got a good number of likes on it, but he found in our data that among 18 to 21-year-old men,
Yeah.
Trump's net favorability, was +7. So 52% said they liked him, 45% said they disliked him. Harris's net favorability was -48. So
That was
24%
shocking.
said
Wow.
they liked her and 72% said they didn't like her. That was shocking to me.
24% favorability rating for Kamala Harris among young men that blew me away.
That's
Yeah.
not that I mean, so I mean, you guys have had Daruni on this podcast, right? She can
We had it
talk
on
about
yesterday,
the
yeah.
gender relations a lot more than I can, right? But what I think I would say, right, is at least when you look at it from the sense of the Democratic Party, right? You had Barack Obama, and then after Barack Obama, what were the big social, cultural movements that happened that the left responded to, right? You had gay marriage in 2015. You had Hillary getting nominated in 2016 by, repudiating the class first stuff that Bernie was doing and going all in on, race identity issues. And in response to that, the party doubled down on that. And then in 2018 and 19, you had Me Too, right? That 1, 2, 3 punch combo is naturally the type of, cocktail to get some kind of radicalization of the male population going, right? Especially for younger Gen Z people. These people were like 10 years old when Donald Trump was president the first time, right? Like when I was 10 years old, okay, Obama was president, right? But when Bush was president, I don't really remember what Bush did, right? Whether he was good or bad, right? People don't necessarily know what Trump did. And even if they like Trump or dislike Trump, that's not saying they support all of those conservative policies that he's doing, right? The tariffs or the deportations or all that.
And
It's,
I think
oh,
that,
this guy vaguely says the right stuff that I kind of, my vibes kind of align with, right? And even if I disagree with him, right, then that's going to put me on the side of Kamala and the Democrats who have now set their entire partisan agenda as being affirmatively pro-woman and affirmatively pro-LGBT, which are two things that, a lot of traditional masculinity is defined in opposition to, right?
I,
And for a lot of non-white people, especially, I mean, white people too, but non-white people who are in, more traditional environments, you're gonna see, swings towards the GOP, which is, I guess, now taking the mantle of defending traditional masculinity, or so they say.
I think that's so true. And I think something that's important, though, for Democrats that I've noticed is it's not necessarily that like Democratic politicians were dominating and completely like proposing all these radical like anti-men policies or whatever. I think it's that Democrats had a huge cultural dominance even through the Trump term that I
Mm-hmm.
think among young people really like is just thought of as connected with liberals and the Democrats. Like even I feel like Hollywood as a whole is thought of as that, where like weirdly people will connect like among these young people. They came of age in a time where people would connect like not liking the new Star Wars movie to actually be kind of the Democratic Party's fault in a weird way. Like I think that
yeah.
is a connection that a lot of young voters made. And when they came of age, you're talking about how Trump was like barely starting his first term and they're still in middle school or whatever. But they also came of age, like the kind of woke culture or whatever, backlash was kind of a younger person counterculture to like years of conservative
Yeah,
reign.
no, when
And I
when
think they
we
came
were
of
in
age where that
college,
was like the dominant culture. And if anything, if they came of age being told like, oh, you can't say this or you might get in trouble for this, if that became the counterculture to be like anti-woke, like kind of Joe Rogan-y barstool types where they're not necessarily that conservative, but it's just a cultural, like it's cool to rebel thing.
I mean, I want to write a lot about this, but like a lot of it has to do with the rise of social media and the internet, right? Like when we were kids, like Twitter was sort of a thing, but it wasn't used as a mass communication way that it is now, right?
I think to
And
a
and
really
the other thing I need to mention, right? I mentioned all the gender stuff, was all of the police shootings as well that were videotaped and broadcast all over the internet, right? In 13 and 14 and 15, right? That had a
20.
big yeah, 2020, of course. How can we forget that, right? When I was a kid, everybody used to make jokes about George Bush and the Iraq War and, him doing 9/11 and all of that, right? Then that was the thing that everybody was rebelling against. I just don't think a lot of people, especially, discourse generators who live in very blue areas where everybody is a liberal, realize the extent to which what they saw as normal, in terms of the cultural zeitgeist, was very abnormal for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And for young people, they were reacting to that.
So one thing I remember that was striking, I have a couple buddies from school who were on the Biden then Harris campaign last summer. There were 14 people on Kamala Harris's digital team who ran the social media and everything. Guess how many of them were straight men?
0.
Goose egg.
One.
None. Wow.
One guy. And I'm not trying to say, oh, this is like why Democrats have lost ground. This is like my one theory of everything. But I think it is a bit of a tell. The campaign, there were all these tweets and memes about Brat Summer. And like, I listened to the album because I heard people talking about it. It was fine. But they didn't speak about the Kendrick Lamar Drake beef once. Every young guy I know was following that. And I was like, come on, that's kind of malpractice to not even address, or to try to get in on that cultural moment if you're going to get in on a different cultural moment that, frankly, more appeals to women and gay men.
That's how we get a Tim Walz tweet from the official account saying that AOC can run a mean pick 6 and that he can call an audible on a play.
I will say, I think on people who live in very blue areas, I'm from Massachusetts. Armin, you are too. It's very blue where we're from. And so, in high school, you see like all the, we have like school walkouts. We have like for climate change, for gun violence, for all these things. You see a lot of left-wing overreach. I recently talked to a friend from here who's from South Carolina, and this person is gay. They're a very chill person, but they mentioned like, oh yeah, like when I came out, my mom was like, don't tell your dad. And I remember thinking like, wow, like that's surprising because your parents are both, like your father's a doctor. They're both educated. And I remember I texted my friends from back home, like, hey guys, like I think we forget sometimes, like, yeah, we see like people going too far, but like we're making up stupid shit like neo pronouns and whatnot. But there's still a lot of places in this country that are not as accepting. And I think that some of the liberal efforts to be more inclusive were targeted towards that. But as Armin said, kind of alienate people whose only experience is living in actually a very blue or a very democratic or a very liberal leaning cultural or online. David Shore had some numbers on the Ezra Klein show about this, about the effect of social media on people's political views. I think he found that like if you're a regular TikTok viewer, you're probably swung like 8 points to the right, 2020 to 2024. And like to some extent, I get it. Like I care about policy and I pay attention to it, so I'll never vote for Donald Trump. But if I did not know or care about policy, I probably would have voted for him because he's a funny guy.
Yeah, a lot of people think, oh, that guy's
not
funny,
charismatic.
whatever.
When he got
I
shot, like that shit was hard.
I want to piggyback on what you said about Tim Walz talking about the mean pick 6, right?
Yeah.
Tim Walz was a football coach for decades, right? He very obviously would not have written that, right? And I think what a lot of men like about Trump, and this is not all men being misogynist, because I'm not one of those Twitter posters that says that and gets 200,000 likes. No. Right. And those things are in their own way, partially responsible for a lot of the woes Democrats have with men, especially young men who are online who see that kind of stuff, right? Is that Donald Trump does not give a damn what he says, and he doesn't have anybody editing his stuff, right?
Yeah.
And the average man is not necessarily, the average man is not a racist or a bigot or whatever bad word you want to say, right? But the average man definitely likes, and I'm a teacher, right? So I'm around kids who say this, the average man wants somebody who stands on business, right? Right? Donald Trump stands on business, right?
Yeah, I mean, guy got shot and pumped his fist. Like,
that shit was hard. Like when
it was
that happened,
badass.
I was like, that's hard as fuck.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
Like,
cool. I mean, that's
even
cool.
like I saw that and I was like, okay, like objectively Donald Trump is an ass, but I mean, I
I mean,
have to
even the
respect the
mugshot,
showmanship there. Like he
even
knows
when he
what he's
just
doing.
when he logged on, he
Um,
was like DonaldTrump.com mugshot. That was it. I was like, come
It's
on,
pretty tough.
bro.
and
It's a little tough.
there's a different way to like, and this is not to say that women can't stand on business because they absolutely can too. It just comes in a different flavor than, doing it as a man because everything is gender coded, right? But the whole pick six, call an audible on a play thing is just emblematic of how everything is edited down and,
Hmm.
watered down to try to offend as few people as possible, right? Because one of the key things in the Democratic Party is that people try not to offend everybody. And that's a noble goal, but then that often has the side effect of just not achieving the actual goal, which is
You
getting
come off
whatever you want
stilted.
done.
100%.
You come off
Well,
fake. Like you can't speak off the cuff.
and they come off fake too because I think it represents like a trying to a shortcut fix where they're like, oh well, we'll just pick a VP who's played football before or like was a coach, and well, he comes off as very conservative coded. He wears flannels.
Well,
If you don't build the broad infrastructure that also supports that, you then have the people running the account who have no idea how to talk like him. Like we need more Tim Walz in the background of Democratic politics, not necessarily just
like
as like
that
candidate.
that's why I don't get mad, at people who say that Walls was a bad pick because he really wasn't, right? A VP pick is just whatever the campaign decides to present somebody as, right? And Walls on paper objectively is a good candidate, right? He won a district that was kind of tough and he held it down for a while. And, he's been a serviceable governor of, Minnesota, and he has all of those conservative values. But the problem is that they packaged it the wrong way, right? If you compare that to JD Vance, right? JD Vance, who's an underperformer, right? He did worse, considerably than you would have expected in his 2022 election. The only time he's ever been on a ballot, right? But, that campaign leveraged all of that, all of his bio and all to complement the message that Donald Trump was doing, right? Donald Trump was here talking about blood and soil. And here comes JD Vance saying, my family has 9 generations of soldiers. And that's why I'm more American than anybody else who showed up here after my ancestor, right? And the people there, even if immigration was not your primary reason there, it was not the reason you didn't vote for him, right? You were okay with that. And I think, and this is why, right, all of these polls about 2028, they're made up of very ideological people and very plugged in people. And we know this from all the polling that's done, but the problem for Democrats is the people who are not plugged in, right? That's why, you know, even in 2028, if you run the same play back, the election, I don't think, okay, no, and I'm not projecting macroeconomic conditions or anything, but I think the coalitional problems of the Democratic Party aren't really going to go away anytime soon.
I
Because,
think in 28 the Republicans will win the Hispanic vote outright. They got
yeah, right? Because
48% this time. They'll get 51 next time.
the people at the helm are too blind to what's going on that they can't see the disconnect like that. And it's a question of fundamental values. And, ultimately, and I do need to write a lot about this. Chat GPT can help me with some of it, no
No, no,
doubt.
you're not using ChatGPT to write, bro. Come on.
No, of course not. I use Chat GPT to help me, just like translate stuff though. It's actually pretty good. Um, right? But there's just two separate worlds, right? Eric Adams, before he was outed as a criminal, said, right, when New York City, there's two different New Yorks, right? There's the one that the gentrified, discourse generating class on Twitter inhabits, which is in Manhattan and the closer parts of the outer boroughs. And then there's the other New York, right? And if you look at the trend map in New York City, right, one trends to the left, one trends to the right. In every election, it's basically the same story, right? And nobody really seems to have any idea to fix it. I think that if there was anybody who was going to be an outright, savior candidate for the Democrats, my personal pundit take, not backed up by any data, but just my own vibes and thinking, is that it's none of them. None of them in that list, right? In 2012, remember, the Republican Party was reeling. You know, they had basically spent the past 4 years stoking all this racial animus. You know, they got 63 House seats, you know, on the Tea Party and all. And in 2012, they were talking about making Obama a one-term president, right? And they lost, right? And then they basically let out their own version of a primal scream, which, you know, how does the story go, right? Mitt Romney was a nice small bean candidate, and Democrats were mean to him, right? And so what did they decide to do? They said, let's nominate Donald Trump. And, you know, it worked for him. He blew up the system, right? I think for a lot of reasons, Democrats could have their own, you know, Trump-like figure, not in terms of being, you know, a brash bully or whatever, but in terms of just being somebody outside the realm of, you know, what is considered, you know, the traditional universe of politicians, right? Because there's a lot of people that are just not served by the existing pool of, you know, action figure Democrats that, you know, you could try to put in there in the ring.
I I completely agree, but my worry is that person would win as the Democratic nominee. I have no doubts about that. But I don't know that they win the Democratic primary and become the nominee. Like I
And
mean,
that is the
we
issue.
could come up with other names, but like on that list, I mean, even though he was listed as the most electable, I think the clearest example of like a potential Democratic Trump is Mark Cuban. He's at 3.2%, 3.5 among young people, who you'd think maybe would give him a boost with the like Shark Tank TikTok approach. But that worries me because I feel like, I mean, I can't really think of anyone honestly besides him who fits that role. And I like literally in the exact model of Donald Trump, where he's built his reputation as a strong, decisive businessman
Well,
who makes tough decisions on TV for years among normie
I
voters. So like,
think the reason
how
for
did they
that
break through?
I think the reason for that is because no one has really been able to seriously land a blow on Trump, right? In metaphorical sense, right? For the viewers, we have to clarify that, right? A metaphorical blow. Um, right? The
And I don't
Democratic
think the other one's
primary,
eligible.
the Democratic primary is controlled by the college-educated white liberal demographic right now, and to a lesser extent, you know, black voters in the South. Black voters in the South have a lot to lose, right, by having elections lose, right? So therefore, they tend to be very pragmatic, and they won't back an outsider unless they have a viable chance of winning. Obama being the exception for obvious reason, right? Um, I think that if Cuban or somebody really actually was able to land some kind of a blow on Trump that was more than a rhetorical, symbolic gesture, you would actually start to see an elite permission structure for generating that kind of outsider enthusiasm, right? It's just we can't see it now because it hasn't actually happened. But if you think about it in terms of what the sequence is to get there, that
What do you
moment,
think that kind of blow might be?
well, so I don't know. I have to be like Gandalf and, you know, look into the Palantir and see exactly what is, you know, going to come in the future. But there's plenty of different opportunities that Donald Trump will present for overreach, right? In terms of various things that he's doing that are abusive to the Constitution and all the other things the Democrats care about, right? And any one of those, right, you know, Donald Trump is going to have to eventually, right? He's not going to be able to eventually keep doing things with impunity on the course that he's taking, right? Even if he doesn't cause a 1929 style Great Depression, his policies are going to cause economic hurt to people. And all of the culture war fun and games are only possible to, you know, for both sides to keep up because the average person is too wealthy to really care about material politics in a meaningful way, right? All of their stuff that they really, really care about is fundamentally stable and they still have, you know, easy access to it, which is why they can indulge in nonsense about, you know, what was that ad? You know,
Most
taxpayer
for they
funded
them,
surgeries for illegal
transgender
transgender
prisoners or
murderers or
something.
something. It's like Mad Lib's chat GPT generated sentence, right?
Yeah.
Right. All of that stuff gets pushed onto people by elites in the Republican Party because I mean, that's just the easiest thing to make a fuss about, right? You can't make a fuss about the economy when the economy is, you know, halfway decent. I mean, when prices were expensive, right? You know, that was a thing, but now that prices are, you know, further down, the Republicans are naturally not talking about it. But you can't keep just doing the endless culture war stuff if people who are used to having a certain sense of material comfort have that threatened. right?
Especially if you're in power and you're the one.
Exactly, right? And at that point, that is when, assuming, Democrats learn how to not, have all of their purity tests and all of their social issues, as they, in 2006, they said, I don't care what you believe on literally anything. You can basically be a Republican with a D next to your name, and let's go almost win Wyoming, right? That's kind of what happened. Um, right? That type of situation is where you really start to see, momentum go against the GOP,
Well,
right? And
it
that
feels to me like when you're talking about landing blows, at least among Democratic voters who are tuned in right now and like responding to this poll, I feel like they perceive landing a blow to be Cory Booker and AOC right now are the two who got
and
the
Van
bump from that.
Hollen, right?
Yes, yes, and
So
I'm sure we'll
so
see
Van
that in
Hollen
future
is the
polls.
type of thing, right? Because
Hmm.
that's, it is a stunt, right? What he did was a stunt. He went there, right? He could have, like, you guys know the story of Leo Ryan, right? Jackie Spears' old boss, who went to
Yeah,
Jonestown and got killed because I don't exactly know what the story was, but he was some kind of cult leader who was doing weird cult leader
it's a
things.
crazy Wikipedia read. It's
Um,
a fun.
right, and he died, right, that legitimately could have been, like, we didn't know if Kilmar Abrego Garcia was alive or dead, right? And honestly, given the lawlessness that Trump and Elon and all have been acting with, they could have jailed Van Hollen too as well. And, you know, I mean, they probably wouldn't have, but would we have really been that crazy to say, oh, they won't? Right? There was a legitimate chance they could have. And Democrats, like, that was the most hopeful I'd seen Democrats in a long time, right? That they actually stood up for people's rights and got, they actually got the people in power to do something that they wouldn't have done otherwise. Right? That is, what, the successful type of activism that I think people are craving. And if, whoever can figure out that formula to actually do that is, I think, going to be the best positioned there.
I totally agree. This is a little fantasy booking, but the only other person that came to mind when I was thinking about what you're saying with landing a blow and having this kind of direct, like confrontational appeal, was honestly Kamala Harris. If she does end up running for governor in 26 and wins, and then she gets to be kind of the public face of like the resistance and pushing back against some order that Trump does, and she's the face of California doing that, I think that could I'm not sure if it's the best move for the
Yes.
Democratic Party, but I could see that happening.
Yes, however, it has to be tailored the right way because Kamala Harris's constituency is liberal white people and black voters in California, right? Those are groups that she has no problem with, but they're not essential to winning a national coalition, right? As far as I can tell, Kamala Harris in every Democratic primary she's had has always been fairly weak with Latino voters, right? In 26, okay, granted, in 2016 she ran against I want to say Loretta Sanchez, maybe it was Linda. It was one of the Sanchez's from California. Um, but I definitely think that, yeah, Kamala could do it again. I don't see why, if she ran for governor in 2 years, she would want to go run for president again. Especially because if a lot of people's favorables of her are so bad anyway, I don't think they're gonna go up when it's pretty blatant office shopping, just to get back into the spotlight like that.
Well, it's interesting that all of what we're touching on here is like I keep hearing outsider, just outsider, outsider, outsider. That whole thing of establishment, of outsider, outsider. The whole Obama in '08 runs anti-establishment. He's like, I'm new, I'm young, I'm a fresh face, and that's the magic that we're losing. The sauce of someone's new, they're gonna shake it up, they're cool, they say what they mean. That Obama can nail a 3-pointer, and don't get me wrong, Obama's really cool. Like pumping your fist and getting shot, really cool. And it sounds like a lot of what I'm hearing is just cool. Outsider shakes things up and just has the sauce.
Yeah,
Like I don't know what to say. It's just someone who has sauce, someone who has just sauce. I mean, it doesn't get any like clearer than
well,
that, really.
yeah.
Maybe
I
the
mean,
middle ground outsider that Democratic MSNBC types are actually okay with is like a Josh Shapiro governor who can say, I'm an outsider to DC politics and I know how to get things done in Pennsylvania. Maybe that's like what Democratic primary voters are willing to accept as an outsider.
and for Josh Shapiro specifically, I think he is very, and they frankly did a pretty gross character assassination on him with the whole VP thing with respect to the Israel Palestine stuff, right? Now, leaving aside how that actual war in Israel and Palestine is playing out, the way that it's affected politics in the Democratic Party is going to be a veritable hornet's nest to try to navigate. And right, the would-be assassin on his house stated that the reason for this attempted assassination was Shapiro supporting the destruction of the Palestinian people or something like that, right? Josh Shapiro has made no such statement, supporting that. And if anything, he's been very, very sympathetic towards, um, you know, accommodating both points of view in terms of, Israel and of Palestine, right? So he
And
could.
I saw this week Tim Walz had 100% approval rating from AIPAC on his voting record while he was in Congress too. It wasn't like
Oh
there was
yeah.
some.
Well, yeah. Walz was a moderate, middle of the road Democrat when he was in Congress. And Shapiro can definitely credibly say, do you really think I support these like lunatic protesters and all, right? Because even if people are sympathetic to pro-Palestine, right, in the sense that they don't want to see TikToks of brutalized children and all, they are very broadly not sympathetic with pro-Palestine protesters because, again, it's the whole Matt Iglesias theory of if you are annoying, nobody likes you and whatever you're supporting, right? Josh Shapiro can say, these guys tried to kill me and my family. Why on earth would I support them, right? So he's defending himself against, people who think that he bows to the left too much, which are frankly a bigger constituency than people who think that he's not left enough, both in a primary and in a general election.
He also seems to me to be the most likely to attack Biden and say that he should have dropped out because I know he was
Oh yeah, Josh
pretty
Shapiro's a
not
fighter.
public during that time.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think so as well. Right. And Josh Shapiro has actually won very competitive elections, right? He actually beat Republicans in what was then a very red down ballot county in, the early 2000s when he first got into politics. So he's not new to this.
And I was going to say, just to build on this, I mean, do you think this is something that Republicans would be aware of? I mean, I remember reading in a Fight by Jonathan Alec that Trump, for some reason, had this weird thing that he thought Josh Shapiro was going to become the nominee when, after the debate, like he just kind of assumed he was cooked, like just done. He was like, oh, they're going to nominate him, and it's over. Like, do you think they're, I mean, aware of this? Like, I mean, it feels like this is one of those things where the out of touch online MSNBC, Twitter,
I
electorate,
mean, I,
whatever,
I
doesn't seem to
think
see it.
that a lot of this Trump is a very Shakespearean figure, and there's a lot of, Shakespearean narratives that get spun around all of his campaigns, right? In 2016, they all thought they were going to lose, right? I mean, they had by rights, they absolutely should have lost. That was a very badly managed campaign that won because Hillary Clinton's campaign was somehow worse, right? Um, this time, yeah, right? Everybody who saw that debate knows Kamala handed his ass to him, right? Um, I don't know. I think that Trump probably knew he was not going to win if the campaign kept it up that way. Do I think Shapiro would have made a difference? I mean, Trump won Pennsylvania by 2, right? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it would have been enough on its own.
Could have
Might have,
saved us that Senate seat.
it might have been able to save Democrats Bob Casey's Senate seat, yeah, right? But the Kamala campaign's analytics team, right? I don't know about, some of their things, but they definitely had people a lot smarter than me who ran all of the testing and said Shapiro Walls, Shapiro Walls, Shapiro Walls. Shapiro is, not necessarily the greatest, fit or whatever. Let's go with Walls. And honestly, that's not a bad play, right? If America and the Democrats can survive another 3.5 years of this, right? Josh Shapiro is most likely going to have 6 years of governing experience under his belt. And he's going to say, look, I have a very good approval rating with Democrats and Republicans in Pennsylvania. I am, sort of middle of the road on some things like vouchers and all that, which again, I know I live in Texas and there's lots of voucher stuff that's going on there and a lot of Democrats don't like it. But independents and Republicans always love, oh, this Democrat, once in a while thinks Republicans have a good idea, right? And that sets him up really well, assuming he does actually, take the plunge. And if you've heard the guy speak, as Twitter people will joke, he is what they call Jewish Obama. Well, him and John Ossoff. But
Well,
I'm
I think
actually,
that's that's true even beyond the actual big speech approach, because I've seen it, like he passes the would you want to have a beer with him test. I saw him on
Well, yeah, no, like
Breakfast
just
Club. He
the
like played
vibes,
basketball in college, I think.
even like his like button-down suits and all that he wears,
Mm-hmm.
like he just, you know, I remember how Obama was, I was a kid, right? Shapiro is the closest one who kind of matches that vibe,
Oh,
right?
cool. Like, look at
Yeah.
the YouTube comments from normies on any podcast appearance he does. They're always like, it's the cliche, like, oh, well, I wish all Democrats were like this.
I think that when everybody says outsider, right? For the past 30 odd years, it's basically been the Clintons and, the Obama machine that have been running the Democratic Party, right? That's all, people have basically known for the past 30 years, right? Because before that, Democrats were getting drubbed by Reagan and Nixon, right? And I think a lot of people are just saying, right, that was a political organization, a political coalition that was built to suit that political moment back in 1992. And we're now going to be 36 years after that, right? 36 years is, the difference between, God knows what, right? 36 years, they still had Zeppelins in World War One, and then they had jet planes in the Korean War,
Well,
right?
and 2028 will have been 20 years since the last Democratic primary that didn't have like a clear kind of anointed, obvious frontrunner going in.
Right?
Like,
Like, there's just been a lot that has changed in the party. And, I'm not, I supported Bernie in 2016, right? I was 17, so I couldn't vote. I was not one of those people that said, oh, it was rigged or whatever. Because, I mean, Hillary did win that primary fair and square. But everybody knows, even Hillary supporters know, that the organization put the thumb on the scale to make it easier for Hillary to win, right? And to a lot of people that are, looking into the political process and not really clubby like that, that just looks like, oh, it's just, a cartel of political actors who are just trying to protect their own people.
So hold on, wait. So if we got Josh Shapiro and John Ossoff's ticket, we could have not one but
Two
two
Jewish
Jewish. Dude,
Obamas.
I'm so excited. As a Jew, I'm so excited. Like I could have not one but two.
Oh
Oh
yeah,
my
that's the
god.
other one I was going to mention is if John Ossoff wins his Senate race this year, then yeah,
Yeah.
he goes up to the top of the list.
100%. That'll be like the biggest, him or Kamala being elected governor would be like the biggest stories coming out of that midterm.
I'm
I
just
mean,
letting you guys know it's
honestly,
over for you guys. We're getting kosher everything after that. I'm decking my house. We're getting pickles. We're getting that what is this? Like crab cakes, potato latkes. Oh, it's gonna be awesome.
the other one who I haven't talked about a lot, and I know that, people like playing fantasy president draft and all, but is Raphael Warnock, right? Because I mean everybody knows there's Ossoff, there's Warnock. I joked back in 2021 that they were the Han Solo and Lando Calrissian of Democratic politics. Well, I mean, Warnock has won many competitive elections. And granted, some of them were because Republicans nominated, frankly,
The
questionably
CTE case.
sentient candidates, right? Um, but he's objectively a very compelling candidate, right? And he has, a strong profile, and he's the heir to Martin Luther King's legacy, right? And he's able to build on that in a way that does not come across as, quote unquote preachy, the way that Hillary's
Mm-hmm.
attempts to talk about race and identity were. And that's ironic. He's a literal preacher who does not come across as preachy when he does it, right?
Yeah.
And, George, I mean, most of Georgia's electorate is white and black, but they also have Hispanics, they also have Asians, right? And those are all critical to building a winning coalition in a state like Georgia. And, you know, Warnock would actually be a very compelling, candidate. The main reason I think it's not talked about is because if they pass a resign to run law, then Governor Kemp would probably, replace him with a Republican. And realistically, we're not flipping the governorship anytime soon, especially if Stacey Abrams decides to run again.
Well, her third term in office.
Well,
Yeah.
speaking of fantasy politics drafting, like for some reason, when we're talking about all these candidates who, to me, a lot of them feel like it reminds me of the Veep steak discussion, where a lot of them kind of feel like, oh, they fill this kind of niche, they appeal to this group, and but maybe not like a full thing. I'm thinking, I wonder if this is a cycle where someone tries this time perhaps successfully, like the Ted Cruz 2016 approach, where they early in the primary kind of enter with a full ticket of one of these two people, kind of to like seem like you're force yourself to be the front runner in a way. Like if a Pete Buttigieg, for example, wanted to do that and like had someone who kind of balances him out with like South Carolina and that kind of stuff, and entered the race early with that, I think that could be effective in this race with so many kind of like prospects to pick from
Yeah.
almost.
I mean, I think Veep stakes, the people who do Veep stakes look at Veep stake candidates as individuals too much, right? And they look at their attributes as like variables to manipulate. Whereas, you know, think of it as, some people, I don't like peanut butter. I'm not allergic. I don't like it, right? Some people do, but peanut butter on its own is one thing, but it's supposed to go with jelly and bread, right? In order to have a thing that's actually what, you're trying to eat, right? And that's the way that I think people ought to be conceptualizing, Veep steaks, right? Harris Walls made a lot more sense just in a vacuum than Harris Shapiro, right? Walls is very much, a supporting actor type of candidate, right? Shapiro can't really do a second fiddle act very, very well, right? Everybody who knows him in politics knows this. He's always wanted to be the top dog, top G, whatever you want to call him. And having two of those is going to cause problems, right? And I think that the Kamala camp probably knew that in terms of how, they would go around doing stuff like that. It's the same with Trump in 2016, right? You guys remember when everyone thought he was going to pick Chris Christie as his VP?
I was a little bit young for that. I don't remember that.
Okay. I was probably 12, so.
Well, look, the thing about that, right, is Chris Christie is basically a slightly less boorish version of Donald Trump, right? You don't need a carbon copy clone of you. You need someone who's going to round out your weaknesses and come across in a way, right? Pence helped with evangelicals, sure, but Pence was very much a doctrinaire, traditional ideological Republican. And here he was giving the mantle of approval and the permission structure for all these other conservatives who didn't think Trump was really a conservative to say, oh, okay, Hillary's bad. Actually, I'm voting for him anyway.
That it's really interesting to map that onto kind of the Democratic primary side of things. Like it was essentially him trying to appeal to his base as like almost weirdly being seen as a bit of like a moderate outsider type. I mean, I keep straining the Mark Cuban as the Democratic Trump comparisons, but I feel like it would be like a Mark Cuban picking an AOC almost or something like
Yeah.
that, which is interesting to think about, like in terms of electability and like how I feel like that would be discussed in the Democratic primary as kind of an extreme choice. But when he picked Mike Pence, people kind of saw it as par for the course and not alienating to moderate swing voters or something.
Like extending like an olive branch to like the establishment and creating like that permission structure of like, hey, like I'm crazy and outside, but also, hey, wait a minute, here's this other person that you guys would love.
Okay, so let's game this out. If Cuban was the presidential nominee, who would be the most outsider? Like, say he wanted to double down on who would be the craziest outsider pick for him to pick?
Stephen A. Smith or something like that. I mean, of the list, just going off that one. But I mean,
I think it would be a businessman type.
Yeah, I don't think he'd pick Stephen A. Smith. That doesn't seem like him.
Honestly, I don't think he would go outsider. I think it would be similar to the Trump blueprint there, and I could see him leaning in on like technocratic kind of competence, intelligence appeal, like a Pete Buttigieg, maybe a Josh Shapiro as that governing experience, and could say like we have the same agenda. I saw Shapiro's kind of running on the abundance agenda stuff. That wouldn't surprise me if Cuban's into that kind of thing with the cost plus drug stuff. But I don't know. I'm struggling in general in this whole conversation to think of outsider Democratic.
Well, exactly.
types.
That's why the Democrats have such an like who? It's like we're waiting for Aragorn to show up and take the banner to Mordor.
And like I feel like all the Democratic versions of this are celebrities and Hollywood types who don't actually have that appeal because they're thought of as
talked
like,
about. That's not going to work. Yeah.
The fact that like if it's someone we would think is a good idea, it's probably not, because we are within that educated like elite circle. It's like if it's someone,
is so is a lot of the Democratic primary base. Like I think that's why
most of us is, yeah.
Stephen A. Smith is flopping after all this like Twitter discussion. Like they too are kind of too smart to fall for that, even if like maybe the general electorate would be.
I will just say, because yesterday was Easter, The story, right, is that the Messiah came from Nazareth, which is a town that basically nobody at the time had heard of. And people were like, oh, wait, Nazareth? Like, actually, you mean, like, Nazareth was basically like from bumfuck nowhere, right? And this is the guy that came to save the world, right? And so, as the prophecy says, God knows what the Nazareth of the Democratic Party is, but that's going to be where the 2028 Messiah shows up from. And you see right there, that's the other thing, is a lot of Democrats don't know how to talk about religion anymore too.
Yeah.
That's very true.
I was gonna say when I was in Texas last week, and I went to a Methodist church in Dallas, and seeing the way that it's done in Dallas, like I'm from Southern California, right? Like I've been to church, we've been to Lutheran ones, like you name it, I've been there. But the way it's done in Texas
Mm-hmm.
was antithetical to the way I've seen it done in California. I've been to a bunch of them there, but like that was church. That was like church with like capital letter church. Like that was something. And like I was like, wow. Like do you like I just was like, okay, this is different. This is new. I'm learning. But we're the out of touch, out of the leads. Like I think about like I want to tie this back into the if people think you're annoying Matthew Iglesias thing, like with the activist group. Is like yeah, it can be kind of annoying if I'm chirping your ear saying like you need to believe this, do the way I talk, land acknowledgments, things like that. Because we all thought it was silly, but no one thought to say it wasn't, and it's kind of hard
Well,
to
I mean,
pitch on that.
and historically, I mean, you guys are probably not old enough, but I remember when the annoying people were the Bible thumping Republicans telling us what to do, right? I'm old enough to remember when Democrats were the cool kids who just wanted to do whatever, and Republicans were the annoying nags, and now it's the reverse.
Well, and I think even more recent history, I mean, I think this wraps in with the perhaps misogyny of the electorate, but I think you could trace that to the last three elections, where I think like 2016
Yep.
Hillary was perceived as that, and then in 2020 with COVID and Biden being like the calm, competent perception, I think Trump was the annoying guy who was always on your TV screen, and you wanted to like the
Oh
famous
yeah, you remember
my
that
favorite
first
ad from the
debate?
election, Biden's ad where it was like shut him up, filling up the ballot box that was his mouth. So, and then this election, I mean, I think people, for better or worse, were like, "Oh, Kamala, she's annoying, telling me what to do. She's laughs," even though I still maintain that
I mean,
came off
I don't
well.
even think it was Kamala herself. I think it was, I don't think people
I agree
disliked
with that. Yeah.
Kamala. I think they disliked the Democratic Party and
Hmm.
therefore disliked, like, I don't think Kamala really had much of a personality at all in this campaign to
And
most
she could
people
have,
like
because like I
Rosette.
saw her in Howard Stern, and she was fantastic. There should have been more
Well,
of that.
yeah, that's the thing, right? So many Democratic politicians themselves have actually won elections. They know how to appeal to people, right? So why don't they? That's the question that we have to figure out. And this is not saying that Republicans know how to, because every Republican not named Trump has failed to replicate the Trump magic. Right? We literally did an article on this, that came out today about the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, right? Elon, who is now vice president, whatever you want to like
Secretary of shit
Trump is
posting.
like Emperor
Or is he anything
Palpatine.
now? I haven't seen him in months. It feels like.
Trump
Hopefully
is
he
like
like.
Palpatine and Elon is like Darth Vader. We'll go with that, right?
Where does Vance fit in?
The flip.
Vance is Governor Tarkin, the guy who says blow up Alderaan because you didn't say thank you. Um, um, and right, Elon spent like $80 million trying to get Brad Schimmel elected. And Schimmel is not a bad candidate, right? Like he's won elections as the attorney general before. He was one of Scott Walker's guys when, they ran the state and were turning it in the right-wing utopia. Problem is, like the electorate just got 7 points bluer because a bunch of Republicans didn't freaking show up, even with $80 million of Elon's, money and all.
Well, I kind of feel like the people who were convinced by Elon's spending, and like the people who were convinced by the Kamala's for they them ad, those types, they're not turning out in
Yeah,
a
They
Supreme Court
they don't
election. Like
they don't really tune into politics, right? Like they
Hmm.
saw that stuff on TikTok and they were like, "Oh yeah, like Democrats are weird anyway. Like I probably wasn't going to vote for him at all."
yeah.
Right? Whereas Wisconsin Democrats now for a decade have basically been reeling under various right-wing, politicians. So they know about turning out, to try and stop right-wing attacks and on their political system. And, Ben Wickler and the Wisconsin Democratic Party have built a very well-organized system of turning out their own voters, right? If you read our article, you see that a lot of those counties in that driftless region, right, that spine of western Wisconsin up the Mississippi River, roughly to Minneapolis, you know, Democrats, roughly, about 20% more likely to turn out to vote in that Supreme Court election than Republicans, right? In some counties, it was like, 70% of Harris voters showed up and voted for Crawford. And it was only like, 50 or 55% of Trump voters who showed up and voted for Schimmel, right? And, every election where Donald Trump is not on the ballot, we've basically seen that same type of pattern actually, come to fruition.
Yep. Well, on that topic, I think that brings up a really interesting thing to discuss leading into 2028. So, if we could briefly look at it, you guys also pulled the 2028 Republican primary.
Yeah,
And of course, this is,
uh,
although you
it's
did a
not a great
question,
result. It's not a great
yeah,
result for our Constitution,
no, it is not.
unfortunately.
But of course, you did a question testing the hypothetical Trump running for a third term. But assuming he is not, this will, of course,
It's
be
going
what
to
you're
be
talking
JD
about, an
Vance.
election without Trump on the ballot, which we have not seen for 3 election cycles now, or
Yeah.
presidential election cycles. So, what did you guys make of these results? Obviously, JD Vance dominating. Of course, even if Trump isn't running, there's always the Trump factor. This might change if he decides he's not too confident in endorsing JD Vance, but what'd you guys make of the results?
My Zachary's theory is that I say Zachary a lot because he's the one who helps me with the weighting, but is that Trump will toy with not endorsing Vance right up until the RNC, and then he'll endorse him at the last minute just to fuck with him because he likes doing that. I think unless Trump endorses someone who is not JD Vance, then Vance will be the nominee. Unless Trump decides to run himself. I mostly think he's just talking shit when he says like, "Oh, but I could go for a third term. 2020 was stolen, so I actually get a third term." Like, I think it's mostly bullshit. Whatever Steve Bannon's obese, stupid ass says. If Trump were to run for a third term, like it seems like he'd get a lot of support. I have friends here at Yale who were like, "I think he should run for a third term," and people were like, "That's illegal, right?" And he's like, "Nah, but FDR did it," and people were like, "The 22nd Amendment." He's like, "Oh, just
Open the
ignore that."
schools.
Hey, as long as you let
Yeah,
Obama run.
bro. Yeah, I know. Then the dude was like denying, like, "Nah, bro, Trump would beat Obama for sure, bro." Love the dude, but like he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about that stuff. But no, I mean, it's concerning that it seems like a majority of Republican primary voters would be open to giving Trump a third term. That's a possible constitutional
He gets a
crisis.
higher percent than JD Vance does in the poll
Yeah.
where Trump isn't even
Well, I mean,
included. That's crazy.
why would you have the knockoff when you can have the original?
Yeah,
Um,
but like even without Trump, like JD Vance
yeah,
basically alone in the field still gets less than an illegal Trump
yeah,
run.
yeah. To me, it was concerning because if Trump runs, it's a question of will Republican state parties put him on the ballot in the primary? Will they have primaries at all if it's very clear that he would have clearly locked up the support? So that's a potentially dangerous and scary question for the country in 4 years. But assuming he doesn't run because he's going to be 80 something, we've seen that 80 something year old presidents don't typically do well in their reelects. Um, yeah, it'll probably be Vance. And I think that Democrats should consider which candidate would be the best contrast to Vance. What are Vance's weaknesses? What I've seen of JD Vance, he's very online and he's in a lot of weird like you remember the discourse the other day about like that fucking Canadian loser who was telling some other guy on Twitter, "Oh, your parents weren't in the Civil War, so like you're not an American."
Oh, the
And
the
then
Nazi, right?
yeah, well, I mean that doesn't
Likely
narrow it
thing.
down. It's like Elon's site now, so a lot of them are Nazis. But you know, Vance like started tweeting about like, "Oh, my ancestors built this country." I'm like, your mom like built herself a perk house or something, like whatever. But I think that's a sign that he's very online and into like weird online right wing subcultures, which might contribute to his relative weakness as a candidate in 22. But
Well, so that's the thing, right? Is the weird right-wing subculture stuff, especially as the educational sorting of, the parties continues to happen, you see more and more, for lack of a better word, normal Republicans you see them moving towards the Democratic Party, right? And so the college educated people you have left in the Republican Party who are, the really high propensity turnout people that are going to be the most reliable voters when Donald Trump is not on a ballot, those guys are increasingly, the ones who, I guess have the politely, I guess you could say, the racial views of Woodrow Wilson, right? Um, and believe in all sorts of these weird esoteric right-wing socio-cultural theories the way that Wilson might have, right? And Vance taps into that. I don't necessarily know that all of the Republican base believes that stuff. Certainly the Nazis on Twitter do, but the ordinary, like average Republican on Twitter probably doesn't. But if it actually came to an election and they got their orders from the GOP elites, then yeah, literally the next day they would all be spouting all this, blood and soil stuff,
Yeah.
right? If Donald Trump told them to, they would, which I think is very, very dangerous. The interesting thing, right, is how would that play in a general, right? Because all the blood and soil stuff is weird, but to the average person, it doesn't directly affect them, right? It's just a crazy guy who's saying crazy things. And the instinct for Democrats is naturally to go in and do all of the Mr. Smith goes to Washington stuff about how that's evil and not who we are and all, right? But Democrats have been baited, time and time again by Trump, right? I will not be a teenager and say the word, but you could say Donald Trump is a master of bait. And right, Democrats keep taking it every time. If they take the bait with Vance, then Vance, who is now a veteran Twitter keyboard warrior, is not going to let up, right?
Yeah.
And so they have to figure out how they can actually smartly, break that fight down without looking weak in the process too, as well.
This weirdly makes me think of the Tim Walz Madden tweet in a weird way, because I think this is an emerging problem for Republicans going forward, where even if, say, JD Vance loses by being a little too extreme, and then they run a semi-normal Republican 4 years from then, the entire Republican infrastructure now, all the young Republicans working in politics, they are all extremely online, weird, Elon, Twitter, Nazi types who are going to be doing Ron DeSantis 2024 weird internet campaign stuff. And
Oh,
I'm
the
sure that stuff
the
will be
the
happening.
Nazi wheel, right?
Yes, and that stuff will be
Yeah.
happening
Well,
through the
it's
infrastructure
not
of the
even
Republican Party going forward. And I do think that's going to be unpopular in general
Yeah,
elections.
I think that it's, the same way that before Elon bought the site, a lot of Democratic operatives spent a lot of time on Twitter, and it really warped their perception of
Mm-hmm.
where people were at. Like, every media tastemaker, even Matt, like he was like, I voted for Bernie. Yeah, everyone was like, oh, Biden's like washed, he's ass, he's not interesting in 2020. And then he cleaned up in South Carolina and he was the nominee. And I think, the same way that old Twitter put Democrats out of touch by exposing them to a consistently more extreme left wing segment of the population, I think new Twitter is increasingly doing the same to Republicans and putting them in this right wing echo chamber where they, you know, collectively convince themselves that actually the country all wants like blood and soil, extreme right wing stuff when like there is a constituency for that, but I don't think it's as big or it runs as deep as like your typical 10 hours a day screen time Republican comm staffer might think.
I mean, I don't even think this is a future problem. Look at 2022, right?
Yeah.
Trump was not on the
Yeah.
ballot, and Republicans lost what, like at least 2 or 3 seats because they nominated, either
Blake
okay, Herschel.
Masters.
Well, Blake Masters is the most obvious example, right? Dr. Oz wasn't crazy; he was just a bad candidate, right?
I don't know how he won that primary.
Oh, Trump didn't even endorse him, right?
You would know more than I would.
I don't think he did. I don't remember if he did. Georgia, right? Herschel Walker was a combination of insane and also, stupid, right?
Just has AB disease.
I thought it was CTE.
Antonio Brown, like, because
Uh,
Antonio Brown has
do you
like
remember when he
the
pulled out
biggest
the
case of
badge
CTE.
at the debate?
It's
I am a
incredible.
sheriff.
Sure,
No
that's a
props
prop.
allowed.
That was so funny. Yeah. And okay, worst of all, and this state is too red to matter, but remember Mike Lee came 10 points away from losing in Utah.
He's
And
nuts. I read this
granted, there
Atlantic
was no
profile of him once.
Democrat, there
He's
was a very
nuts.
conservative independent, but Mike Lee masks it because, when he first came to office in 2010, the GOP was not as openly permissive of being like, weird and crazy like it is now. But Mike Lee is basically how Blake Masters would be in the Senate.
I mean,
Well,
like,
Mike
he's a
Lee's
50
Twitter
plus year old
account
dude
was a
who's
It's
burner.
based
Mike
Mike
Lee.
Lee.
It was a burner
Yeah.
for years, and it got discovered, right? And then now he just uses it as his own, and it
Have you
is
guys ever
equally insane.
have you guys ever read this one Atlantic profile? I think it was Tim Alberta about Mike Lee. It's nuts. Like, the guy is like, it's the level of dick riding he's doing for Trump is crazy. But like, it was just an insane article. He was like, yeah, there's basically nothing that Donald Trump could ever do that's wrong, and I would do whatever for him, like anything.
Oh,
Insane.
yeah, and the other Senate race, New Hampshire, right? Well, okay, in our war model, Maggie Hassan would have won anyway, but even against somebody like Chris Sununu, she probably would have won, right? But Don Bolduc, basically forced the Republicans to stop caring about that race, So, granted, the presidency is a different beast because, they're going to obviously care about that no matter what. But there's still, it's not helping them when they nominate, crazy people. Everybody always looks at things and says they're foreordained to happen, right? But that's not true, right? There's many different paths that the universe can diverge onto, right? Imagine if Hillary won, right, in 2016. Donald Trump and his movement would probably have never been let within 100 miles of a presidential nominating office ever again,
And they
right?
probably would have overcorrected away from
Right?
that.
Because Donald Trump, because if Hillary won, she probably has a Democratic Senate with her, as well as a liberal Supreme Court that's going to be poking the bear at Republicans for the next 30 years instead of what we have now, right? And they would never let them live that down ever again, right? It's the same way that, Democrats basically, you know, I after all the race stuff in 1968, right? Democrats did not touch the issue of race nationally with a 10-foot pole ever again, right? Because it was the thing that broke the camel's back of their coalition, right? The only time that really started to come to the forefront again was when We Are Alive Now, right? When in the Obama presidency, right? 50 years after all of that, right? So one really stinging loss can really change things and, ruin the ability of it to get taken seriously, right? It's the same with, all of the Palestine activism, right? Because everybody said, why are these people, voting for Trump? He's obviously a lot worse and all, right? And people have irrational ways for voting, right? That's their thing. But a lot of people in power in the Democratic Party are not going to listen to them seriously, right? You can see on Twitter among the people in the Democratic Party, a lot of people who previously voted Democratic and shifted to Trump, if they're getting screwed over by tariffs or deportations or whatever it is, the impulse in 2017 would have been, oh, I'm sorry, welcome back, come vote for us again. Now it's, oh, call the police, fire, help, there's just not empathy for it anymore.
100%. I don't want to hold you guys for too long, but Milan, I love your take on Trump in 2028. I could so see that happening where he almost weirdly, like, I could see him thinking like, oh, this is like to make him not look like Kamala Harris, or like in spite to prove that we're the real Democratic Party. And he kind of thinks of it like, oh, I want JD Vance to kind of prove himself having to fight
Well, I
in the
don't even think
primary.
it's that. I just think he like wants to fuck with the guy. I think you
Well, no, a
remember when
little
he
bit of that too. Like, it's kind of like
right.
it's a test of like, oh, well, how will he fend if I kind of
Yeah.
screw with him like this? Can he rise to the occasion? And I'm sure the poll will look like that, so it won't be a real race. But I love that theory of Trump endorsing at the last minute. But I know you guys probably got to run. We don't want to hold you too long.
I was just going to say, thanks so much for coming on, guys. I mean, obviously, we didn't exactly cover exactly what we intended,
It's
but you
fine.
know what? It was a great time. I'm being honest. I'm just sitting here listening. I'm like, wow, it's like having like an episode just for me, and I'm just sitting here. This is great. Thanks so much for coming on, you guys. Milan,
Yeah,
Armin,
thank
thanks
you
so
so
much.
much.